Welcome to Hope is Here. It's hard to believe it's only about a month till Easter is here, a little bit late this year, late April, but we're going to talk about the resurrection today. We're continuing our conversation with Jon Meyer. He's with a wonderful ministry called Christi. We're going to be telling you more about that at the end of this program. But, John, let's talk a little bit about the resurrection, the thing that separates Christianity from all religions. You know, the Bible tells us that Jesus rose from the dead 3 days after he died. What can you tell us today to help our skeptical friends with understanding this event?
Right. Well, I think Paul puts it pretty plainly in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, look, this is the pinnacle piece to our faith. If Jesus is not raised from the dead, our faith is in vain. There is no point in doing what we're doing. And so we need to talk about the reasons we have for believing that Jesus actually rose from the dead and actually overcame the grave. The way I like to do this is a piece that my mentor, Tim McGrew, and I sort of came up with. Well, I came up with like one small part of it. He did most of the work on it. But it's this idea of these 5 pieces of evidence, and they spell out the word alive. So maybe get out a piece of paper, not if you're driving, of course. Wait till you get home to do that. But and spell out the word alive down the paper, okay? And we'll fill those in for you as we go. We can start with the A. Okay, the A is appearances. A is appearances. The evidence from appearances is interesting. In 1 Corinthians 15, there is an early creed of the church. So you may have heard of like the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed. You probably say those in church every so often, maybe every week, depending on what church you go to. This was an early creed of the church that's recorded for us in 1 Corinthians 15. And the interesting thing about this is scholars, even skeptical scholars who are not Christians, are putting this material at 1 to 2 years, some of them even weeks or months after the events of the resurrection. So this information is very early. Okay? And it's recorded in a letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthians in about 54 or 55 AD. He says this. This is what the creed says. For I passed on to you as most important what I also received. And that's just a Jewish way of saying, here's a creed, basically. That Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. That he was buried. That he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures. And that he appeared to Cephas, that's Peter, then to the 12. Then he appeared to over 500 brothers at one time. Most of them are still alive, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Now, some people say, well, maybe they just saw Jesus from the back across the marketplace, and he was, I kind of saw a guy that looked like Jesus today. Well, that's not the idea. Jesus stood with them face to face. He spoke with them. He touched them. He ate with them. Okay, now he ate with them, I think, is a really important piece here, because one of the heartthrob ideas today among the skeptical community is that they saw a hallucination. Skeptics will say it was a hallucination or it was a ghost or something. But here's the thing. Ghosts don't raid the fridge. If you see I know that's like the idea of the Slimer back in Ghostbusters back in the 80s, right? That this ghost is eating things. But spirits don't eat. This was a person who appeared and ate food with them. Hallucinations don't do that. If you hallucinate someone ate your lunch and then it's gone, and you look, your lunch is gone, that wasn't a hallucination. Someone ate your lunch, So it wasn't just a hallucination. This wasn't just an appearance to one person. It was an appearance. There were appearances in cities. There were appearances in the country. Appearances one-on-one in small groups in a crowd of 500, inside a locked room, outside, to believers and to skeptics, to Saul, who became Paul, and to Jesus' brother James. Now, I think it's important to think even about James, right? James ends up becoming a pillar of the church in Christianity when he didn't believe and actually taunted him at one point to go down to Jerusalem where he would almost certainly be killed by the religious leaders. Now, what does it take to convince you that your crazy religious brother is God incarnate, resurrected from the dead, that you are willing to die for him? Now, what would it take to convince you that your brother is God, right? That would take some.
All right, great stuff there. What about L? What does the L stand for? We're spelling out alive, talking about Jesus and the resurrection. What's the L stand for?
Well, the L is somewhat controversial these days. The idea is that it's the low status of women. Now, before you start throwing tomatoes at me, let me explain this. In the time of Jesus, the idea of the status of women was pretty low. In fact, Rabbi, especially when it came to testimony, Rabbi Eleazar said, "Let the words of the law be burned rather than committed to women." That's pretty hardcore. The Jewish Talmud says that basically, at best, a woman's testimony was worth half of a man's. Okay? Now, Paul and Jesus were radicals in this area in that they had very different views of women, very high views of women compared to the culture of their day. But the idea is that you wouldn't use a woman. The idea was that, women make stuff up. You have these old wives' tales. It's kind of as we would see a kid today. Okay? You don't want to have a kid as your primary witness with something as big as someone coming back from the dead. So it was the same idea back then. You would not have women listed as your primary witnesses to something if you were making a story up. You're going to have high-powered individuals, Pharisees, and things like that. But every single gospel shows that women were the first to discover the empty tomb and to see the risen Jesus.
All right, the letter I.
This one stands for immediate proclamation. Immediate proclamation. So, if I'm going to make up a story about a guy coming back from the dead, what do I want to do? I want to go as far away from where the events happened as possible so nobody can check it out. And I want to wait as long as possible. Wait till all the witnesses are dead. Okay? That is not what the disciples did. The disciples are proclaiming the risen Jesus 50 days after it happened in the very city that it happened in. Now keep this in mind. They're sitting in Jerusalem saying this. They're saying, yeah, he rose from the dead. His empty tomb is right over there. By the way, that guy saw him, that guy saw him, and that guy saw him. If you want to go ask him, go ahead. The evidence is fresh. The eyewitnesses are right in front of you. Go talk to them. And people were checking it out, and thousands were coming to believe it. That's an important piece.
We're talking about Jesus' resurrection. We're spelling out the word alive. A was for appearances. L, we talked about the low status of women. I is immediate proclamation. What does the letter V stand for?
V stands for voluntary suffering. Now, there are differing ideas about how good the evidence is for what happened to the disciples. Some of them are better than others. As far as their testimony, sometimes it's just church tradition, what happened. But we know that pretty much every single one of the disciples died for what they believed in, and all of them suffered, even fairly greatly, for what they believed in. Now, this is an important piece. No one willingly dies for something they know is a lie. No one willingly suffers great sufferings for something they know is a lie. Okay? But yet, the disciples suffered and died proclaiming that they had seen the risen Christ. And people will say, oh, people suffer and die for all kinds of crazy religious beliefs. Okay, that's true, but it's not just something they think or they feel or they read about it and they think that is what they were dying for. What they were willing to die for is the claim that they had seen their friend alive 3 days after he had died. So that's really important piece.
All right, letter E. What does the letter E stand for?
Well, the letter E just stands for the empty tomb. And now Matthew claims that the tomb was empty. And there's this idea that the Jews are saying the disciples stole the body. Now, that's a ridiculous idea for a couple of different reasons. Maybe someday I could come back and talk about some of these alternate views. But Justin Martyr, who was an early Christian writer, he's writing around 150 in his dialogue with Trypho, is saying that the Jews are still saying the same thing. They're still saying that the disciples stole the body. Okay? Now, think about this. I don't think that's true, and I think we have good evidence, good reasons to believe the disciples didn't and couldn't have stolen the body. But understand what this presupposes. You don't make up a story about how the body disappeared if there's still a body in the tomb. So this idea that there is a missing body, that there's a story about why the body went missing, shows that the body was in fact missing, that the tomb was in fact empty.
All right. Been great stuff here. We've been talking with Jon Meyer this week. A couple resources that John recommends. One about the resurrection is Evidence for the Resurrection by Josh and Sean McDowell. That's Evidence for the Resurrection by Josh and Sean McDowell. Also a book that I've read. It's an easy read. It's called The Case for Easter by Lee Strobel. Some of you may know him. He also wrote a book called The Case for Christ, which is outstanding. If you've got somebody, a friend that's not a believer and they are wired up intellectually, Lee Strobel was a former attorney and a writer for the Chicago Tribune, so you should check out The Case for Easter by Lee Strobel or The Case for Christ. John, it's been a great week with you. Share a little bit about your ministry, and I know there are people listening saying, man, we want to help Love on College students, help give a safe place to dialogue about their faith. Tell us a little bit about Radio Christi, and if people want to get involved either with their time or their financial resources.
Sure. This is a passion of mine, and I love doing this stuff. And I make myself available to talk to churches. I've filled in for pastors before. I've also so that's something I'm definitely willing to do on a Sunday morning or Sunday evening. I also have talked to a number of youth groups, and I would love to do that, talk to college groups or high school groups, and just give them some of this information. I think it's so important to be able to do that. And I'm not going to break the bank in doing it. I've come to a point where I've said that I'm going to take whatever people give me, and even if that means it's free, and I don't get anything for speaking, that's what I'll take. If I travel somewhere, it'd be nice to get a little gas money or something. But I'm not going to say, I need $1,000 to show up or something of that nature. I do this because I think it's important and I love it. Now, if people want to be able to contribute to me and the ministry that I'm doing financially, they can go to jonmeyer.ratiochristi.org. And so that's just JONMEYER, and then dot, and then ratio, it's like ratio, and then Christ with an I, ratiochristi.org. jonmeyer.ratiochristi.org, and that'll do it.
And what time do you guys meet at UK on Wednesdays?
4 p.m. in the Student Center.
All right. Well, that's going to be a wrap for this week on Hope is Here. Jon Meyer's been our guest with Radio Christi. I hope that you will share these podcasts with some friends. Go to our website, hopeishere.today. That's hopeishere.today.